Midnight, Ottawa time. That was the deadline. A 50% tariff aimed squarely at billions of dollars in Canadian goods was set to take effect the moment the clock struck 12. Hockey sticks, wine, cement, dairy products, plywood, ordinary items, the kind that crossed the world's longest undefended border every single day without anyone thinking twice about them, were suddenly at the center of a political standoff between two allies who have spent more than a century calling each other friends. And then, just hours before that deadline hit, something shifted. Not a retreat, not a surrender. Something quieter, and in its own way, more telling. This is the story of how Washington pushed one more time, how Ottawa answered without shouting, and how a trade relationship that both sides insist is still healthy has spent the better part of 2 years lurching from threat to pause to negotiation and back again. To understand why a 50% tariff threat landed the way it did in the third week of August 2026, you have to go back to the spring of 2025, when Donald Trump, newly returned to the presidency, began reshaping American trade policy country by country. Canada was among the very first targets. In March of 2025, a 25% tariff was imposed on a wide range of Canadian goods. Ottawa responded in kind, matching the move with its own 25% counter tariffs on American products, a retaliation that Canadian broadcasters covered extensively at the time. It was the first real sign that this was not going to be a short-lived dispute. By July of 2025, the pressure had already escalated again. In a letter posted to his social media platform and later confirmed by the BBC and multiple wire services, President Trump informed Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney that tariffs on Canadian goods would rise from 25% to 35%, effective August 1st. The letter, as reported by the BBC, warned that if Canada chose to raise its own tariffs in response, whatever increase Canada applied would simply be added on top of the 35% the United States was already charging. It was less a negotiating position than an ultimatum, and it set the tone for the following year. The stated justification, according to a White House fact sheet released around that period, centered on Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, an obscure and rarely used provision that allows the president to impose tariffs on countries accused of discriminating against American exports. The fact sheet specifically pointed to Canada's automotive sector, alleging that Canada operated tariffs and quotas on American-made vehicles that did not apply equally to vehicles from other countries, and that these policies had pressured American auto manufacturers to shift production north of the border rather than keep it at home. According to the same fact sheet, Canadian imports of American motor vehicles fell by roughly 22%, or about $5.6 billion, in the 12 months spanning April 2025 through March 2026, compared to the prior year. That figure became one of the central talking points the administration would return to again and again over the following months. There was a second, more emotionally charged justification layered on top of the trade numbers. Trump repeatedly linked the tariffs to the flow of fentanyl across the northern border, arguing in his own words that Canada had failed to stop the drug from entering the United States. Independent reporting at the time, however, noted that the actual volume of fentanyl crossing from Canada into the U.S. was, in the words of multiple outlets covering the story, only a marginal fraction of what enters through other routes. That gap between the stated justification and the verified data became a recurring friction point in coverage of the dispute. And it is worth being upfront about here, too. The fentanyl argument was real, in the sense that Trump made it publicly and repeatedly. Whether it reflected the actual scale of the problem is a separate question, and independent data has consistently suggested it did not. Layered on top of the trade dispute was something even harder to quantify: rhetoric about sovereignty itself. Trump has, on multiple occasions documented by outlets including Deadline and BBC, floated the idea of Canada becoming the 51st American state, a notion Canadian officials and independent analysts alike have described as being without any serious legal or political merit. Still, the comments landed hard in a country that takes its independence seriously, and they added a layer of national pride to what might otherwise have remained a purely economic argument. When Canada moved in the fall of 2025 to recognize Palestinian statehood, Trump responded on his social media platform with a message reported by Deadline, writing that the decision would make it, in his words, very hard to reach a trade deal with Canada, closing the post with a sarcastic reference to Canada's national anthem. It was a small moment, but it captured something important about how personal and unpredictable this dispute had become. Trade policy was no longer just about steel, aluminum, or auto parts. It was tangled up with foreign policy positions that, on paper, had nothing to do with tariffs at all. Through the back half of 2025 and into 2026, the pattern repeated itself with a rhythm that became almost familiar to anyone following Canadian business news. A deadline would approach. Tariffs would be threatened, raised, or reimposed. Canada would respond, sometimes with counter tariffs, sometimes by quietly removing them again. In October of 2025, Canadian broadcast coverage confirmed that Canada had cut its counter tariffs against both the United States and China, a move that drew a mixed reaction domestically. Some saw it as a pragmatic de-escalation. Others saw it as capitulation. By December, Trump was reportedly warning of what he called very severe tariffs, specifically targeting Canadian fertilizer, another sector that had, until that point, stayed largely outside the fight. Which brings the story to August of 2026, and to the moment that gives this story its title. On July 20th, 2026, the White House formally signed proclamations imposing an additional round of 50% tariffs on certain Canadian goods, again invoking Section 338. This was not a threat this time, it was signed. The fact sheet released that day repeated the earlier arguments almost word for word. Canada's auto sector quotas, the drop in American vehicle exports, the language of discrimination and unequal treatment. But the actual implementation date kept moving, and by the middle of August, both governments were racing against a new deadline. According to reporting from the Washington Post, published August 15th, industry executives and trade specialists following the closed-door talks said the United States and Canada were, in the paper's words, inching closer to a deal that would avert the punitive 50% tariffs on products like hockey sticks, wine, and cement. It was cautious optimism, the kind reporters use when a deal is close but nothing is signed. 2 days later, on August 17th, NBC News reported that the two countries had resumed trade talks with the clock now running out before the new tariffs were set to hit on Wednesday, August 19th. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, speaking to reporters, described the negotiations as very delicate and intense and said he intended to speak directly with Trump before the deadline arrived. At the same time, Canada's own broadcaster, CBC, reported that the two sides appeared to be at an impasse, a striking contradiction to the cautiously hopeful tone coming out of Washington just 2 days earlier. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it illustrates something true about how these negotiations actually unfold. There is rarely a single, clean narrative. There is instead a fog of competing signals, on-background briefings, and public statements that sometimes contradict each other right up until the very last moment. That last moment arrived late on Tuesday, August 18th. According to CNN Business, President Trump postponed the 50% tariff that had been set to take effect at midnight, a tariff that would have affected roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian imports. NBC News, citing the same sequence of events, confirmed that Trump paused the tariffs for 3 days and said the two sides had reached what he called a deal. It is important to be precise about what did and did not happen at this stage. The tariffs were paused, not permanently canceled. A framework was announced, not a finalized, legally binding agreement. That distinction matters. And it is exactly the kind of distinction that gets lost when a story gets compressed into a single dramatic headline. The following morning, Wednesday, August 19th, the story moved into its next phase, and this is where Ottawa's response becomes the real center of the narrative. According to BNN Bloomberg, Prime Minister Carney was scheduled to brief his own cabinet in a virtual meeting and then hold a separate virtual session with Canada's provincial premiers to walk them through the terms of the emerging deal. In a statement posted to social media that same day, Carney said the draft agreement built on Canada's existing trade advantages with the United States, and in his words, reinforced that Canadian advantage. It was measured language, not triumphant, not defiant, measured. And then came the detail that gives the story its quieter, more revealing texture. According to the Globe and Mail, Carney asked Canada's premiers to do two specific things as the deal moved toward finalization: restock American alcohol on Canadian store shelves, and end the procurement bans that several provinces had placed on American companies and products as part of the earlier retaliatory measures. CBC News confirmed the same detail, reporting that provincial liquor authorities, including Ontario's LCBO, would begin returning American whiskey and other spirits to their shelves after having pulled them during the height of the trade dispute in 2025. This was, in a very literal sense, Canada's silent response. Not a counter-tariff, not a public rebuke, a quiet instruction delivered through official channels to stand down from the retaliatory posture Canada had held for the better part of a year and a half. It is worth pausing here to be honest about what this framing does and does not support. The title of this piece describes Canada's response as one that hits back. Based on the verified reporting available, that is not quite an accurate description of what actually happened in the days around August 19th. What happened was closer to the opposite. Ottawa's actual documented move was to de-escalate. Carney's public statements, the instruction to restock American alcohol, and the request to drop procurement bans all point toward accommodation rather than confrontation. If there was a silent hit back at play here, it may be better understood not as retaliation, but as leverage exercised through patience. Carney and his negotiating team, led on the ground by Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Chief Trade Negotiator Janice Charette appear to have used more than a year of alternating tariffs and pauses to extract concessions without ever matching Washington's 50% escalation dollar for dollar. That is a form of pushing back. It is simply a quieter one than the title might initially suggest, and it is important that this script says so plainly rather than dressing up a diplomatic de-escalation as a dramatic act of defiance. So what did Canada actually get, according to the reporting available as of this recording? United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer, appearing alongside LeBlanc in Washington, told reporters that he felt confident the agreement would protect American workers and jobs while strengthening what he called the North American market, framing the continent as a potential manufacturing and energy powerhouse. Greer specifically said, in comments reported by BNN Bloomberg, that the two sides had eliminated some of the irritants built up over the past year. CNBC, reporting on the same day, laid out several specific elements that sources close to the talks pointed to. Trump reportedly hinted that the agreement could include the restart of the Keystone XL pipeline project, the long-planned oil pipeline running from Alberta to Nebraska that was scrapped back in 2021 under then-President Joe Biden. Trump also signaled that changes to U.S tariffs on Canadian autos could be part of the package, along with a possible reduction in the standing tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, sectors that had been hit by earlier, separate rounds of tariffs entirely apart from the 50% threat that triggered this latest round of talks. None of these specific elements, as of the most recent reporting, have been confirmed in a finalized public document. CBC News was direct about this uncertainty, reporting that both Carney and Trump hailed the new framework deal publicly, but that neither side had released the actual details. Sources speaking to CBC indicated that U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos were expected to drop, but the word expected is doing a lot of work in that sentence. This is precisely the kind of gap between announcement and documentation that deserves to be flagged rather than glossed over. A political win can be announced long before its terms are locked into an actual, signed, and enforceable agreement, and history in this particular relationship has shown that announcements do not always survive the following weeks intact. There's also the question of how Canadian business groups and workers actually feel about all of this, and here again, the picture is not uniformly celebratory. The Washington Post, in its coverage from mid-August, noted that industry representatives and trade specialists welcomed the tariff pause but stressed that the uncertainty of the preceding months had already done real damage to Canadian businesses. Companies that rely on predictable cross-border trade, from steel producers to auto parts manufacturers to smaller exporters of goods like maple products and building materials, had spent more than a year making decisions under conditions of genuine unpredictability. Algoma Steel, a major Canadian steel producer, announced plans in late 2025 to lay off roughly 1,000 workers, a move that Canadian labor representatives directly linked to the broader trade pressure facing the sector. That is not a footnote. That is a real human cost, sitting underneath the diplomatic language of frameworks and reinforced advantages. It is also worth remembering the scale of what is actually at stake in this relationship, because the numbers involved are large enough that they can start to feel abstract. Canada sends roughly 3/4 of all its exported goods to the United States, a dependency that makes it structurally vulnerable to exactly this kind of pressure campaign. The United States, meanwhile, remains by a wide margin Canada's single most important trading partner, which means that even as Washington applies pressure, American companies and consumers on the other side of that same border are absorbing costs too. Economists cited in NBC's coverage of the original tariff threat pointed out that a 50% tariff on goods like Canadian building materials and dairy products would almost certainly translate into higher prices for American consumers as well, undercutting the idea that tariffs are a cost paid exclusively by the country on the receiving end. Inflation, in other words, does not respect borders any more cleanly than trade itself does. Zoom out far enough, and a clear pattern emerges across the full 18 months of this dispute. Trump escalates. Ottawa absorbs the shock, negotiates, sometimes retaliates modestly, and ultimately works toward a deal rather than an open break. Then, months later, a new deadline appears, a new tariff threat lands, and the entire cycle begins again. This has happened enough times now that it has become a recognizable rhythm in North American trade policy, one that Canadian journalists and American trade reporters alike have started treating almost as a seasonal event rather than a singular crisis. That repetition is itself part of the story. It suggests a relationship that both governments understand is too economically intertwined to actually break, even as one side keeps testing exactly how far it can push before something gives. What makes the August 2026 chapter particularly worth watching closely is the timing of Carney's instruction to Canadian premiers. Asking provinces to restock American alcohol and drop procurement bans before a final legal text has even been published is, in political terms, a calculated bet. It signals confidence that the deal will hold. It also reduces Canada's own leverage the moment those retaliatory measures come off the shelves, literally and figuratively. If the finalized agreement ends up falling short of what LeBlanc and Charette believe they negotiated in Washington, Ottawa will have already given up some of its bargaining chips in a gesture of good faith. That is a genuine risk, and it is one that Canadian opposition politicians and premiers themselves are reportedly watching closely, according to the same Globe and Mail reporting that first detailed the instruction. There is also a broader geopolitical backdrop worth mentioning here, because trade disputes rarely exist in a vacuum. Throughout 2025 and into 2026, Trump's administration pursued a strikingly similar playbook with dozens of other trading partners simultaneously, sending what the BBC described as more than 20 separate letters to various countries within a single week back in July of 2025, each one threatening new tariffs unless a fresh deal could be struck. Japan and South Korea, both close American allies, received similar letters around the same time Canada did. This matters for understanding Canada's position specifically, because it means Ottawa was never negotiating in isolation. It was one node in a much larger, simultaneous global renegotiation of American trade relationships, which arguably gave Washington additional leverage across the board, but also meant that Canada's specific complaints could sometimes get lost in the noise of a much bigger, multi-front trade campaign. As this recording is being made, the situation remains, in the most literal sense, unresolved. A framework has been announced, a 3-day pause has been granted, Cabinet and premiers have been briefed, alcohol is reportedly going back on Canadian store shelves. But the finalized, legally binding text of the agreement, the version that will actually determine tariff rates on steel, aluminum, autos, and the dozens of other product categories caught up in this dispute, has not yet been made public by either government. That is the honest state of play, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than papered over with confident predictions about exactly how this will end. Before wrapping up, it is worth being transparent about where the information in this script actually comes from and where the picture is still incomplete. The core reporting draws on CNN Business and NBC News for the sequence of the tariff pause itself, the Washington Post and Bloomberg for the state of negotiations leading up to the August 19th deadline, and BNN Bloomberg, CBC News, and the Globe and Mail for the details of Carney's briefings and his request to Canadian premiers. The background on Section 338 and the administration's stated justifications comes directly from White House fact sheets published in July and August of 2026. The BBC's coverage from July of 2025 provides the earlier context on the 35% tariff letter and the broader wave of tariff threats sent to other countries at the same time. Where this script noted uncertainty, such as the exact final terms of the steel, aluminum, and auto tariff changes, or the actual status of the Keystone XL pipeline discussions, that uncertainty reflects the genuine state of public reporting as of this recording, not a gap in research. Those details simply have not been confirmed in writing by either government yet, and any script claiming otherwise would be getting ahead of the facts. If you want to actually follow where this goes next, rather than just this one moment frozen in a headline, that is exactly the kind of story that rewards sticking around for. Deals like this one tend to get finalized, revised, or occasionally quietly abandoned in the weeks that follow the initial announcement. And the difference between the framework Trump and Carney described this week and whatever eventually gets signed into actual policy is often where the real story lives. Subscribing means you will not have to go searching for that follow-up. It will simply show up the moment the finalized terms or the next escalation actually happen. It is also worth remembering that this is not the first time this exact cycle has played out between Washington and Ottawa, and based on the pattern of the last 18 months, there is a reasonable chance it will not be the last. Channels covering this story tend to move on once the initial drama fades, right around the point where the more consequential details, the ones buried in trade ministry filings and finalized tariff schedules, actually start to emerge. Staying subscribed is really just a way of making sure you are still watching when that happens, rather than catching it secondhand weeks later. And if this kind of grounded, source-by-source breakdown of how these trade disputes actually unfold is useful to you, there's a lot more of this specific relationship still to unpack, from the auto sector quotas at the heart of the original dispute to the fentanyl data that never quite matched the political rhetoric around it. Subscribing keeps that ongoing analysis in front of you as it happens, rather than as a retrospective explainer months after the fact. So here is the honest, open question worth sitting with. Canada has now spent the better part of 2 years absorbing tariff threats, negotiating in good faith, occasionally retaliating, and ultimately walking things back toward compromise every single time a deadline actually arrived. Is that a sign of a smart, patient negotiating strategy that protects a deeply intertwined economic relationship without letting it collapse? Or is it a pattern that simply teaches Washington that another escalation, another deadline, another 50% threat will eventually produce the same result? That is not a rhetorical question, dressed up to sound provocative. It is genuinely unclear, even to trade specialists who have been watching this relationship closely for years, and reasonable people looking at the exact same set of facts in this script could land in very different places on it. Let us know where you land, and we will see you in the next one, once the actual text of this deal, and not just the framework, finally makes it into the open. Before that, though, it is worth going a little deeper into a few threads of this story that often get compressed or skipped entirely when it gets told as a single, tidy headline, because the texture underneath the headline is where most of the real understanding actually lives. Start with the automobile sector, since it sits at the very center of Washington's stated justification for all of this. The White House fact sheet from July 2026 did not simply claim that Canada treated American vehicles unfairly in the abstract. It pointed to a specific mechanism, import quotas, that, according to the administration, allowed vehicles from certain other countries to enter Canada more easily than vehicles built in the United States, while simultaneously creating pressure for American automakers to build plants in Canada rather than expand production domestically. This is a genuinely technical argument, and it is one that Canadian trade officials have pushed back against in various public statements over the past year, arguing that the quota system in question predates the current dispute by many years and was never designed as a mechanism to disadvantage the United States specifically. Untangling which version of that story is more accurate requires digging into the actual quota agreements themselves, which are not the kind of thing that fits neatly into a single sentence of a fact sheet or a single soundbite from a press conference. What is verifiable is the headline number both sides have cited, a roughly 22% or $5.6 billion decline in Canadian imports of American-built vehicles across the 12 months ending in March 2026, according to the White House's own figures. Whether that decline is best explained by the quota system, by broader economic conditions, or by some combination of both is a question that has not been definitively settled in the public reporting available. Then there's the steel and aluminum picture, which runs on a mostly separate track from the 50% tariff threat that triggered the most recent standoff. Canada has been subject to a global 50% tariff on aluminum and steel imports imposed by the Trump administration, a policy that applies broadly across most trading partners rather than being targeted specifically at Canada. Layered on top of that has been a 25% tariff on cars and trucks not built in the United States. Again, a global measure rather than a Canada-specific one. This distinction matters because it explains why Canadian officials, in briefings described by CBC News, were specifically pushing for relief on steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs as part of the broader framework deal, separate from the 50% threat tied to hockey sticks, wine, and cement. There were, in effect, multiple overlapping tariff regimes running at once, some targeted directly at the perceived trade imbalance, others part of broader global measures that happened to sweep Canada up along with dozens of other countries. Collapsing all of that into a single number or a single deadline, as headlines often do, understates just how layered and complicated the actual policy landscape has become. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, generally known by its acronym, CUSMA, also deserves more attention than it usually gets in shorter coverage of this dispute. Goods that comply with CUSMA's rules of origin have, for most of this period, remained exempt from the newer rounds of tariffs, according to reporting from the BBC in the summer of 2025. That exemption is a big part of why the actual economic impact of these tariff threats, while significant, has not been quite as catastrophic as a simple 50% number might suggest on its own. A large share of cross-border trade between the two countries continues to move under CUSMA's protections, even while headline tariff rates rise and fall around it. The products caught in the crossfire of the most recent 50% threat, things like non-compliant hockey sticks, certain wines, and specific categories of building materials, represent a meaningful but bounded slice of the total trading relationship, not the entirety of it. It is also worth returning to the human and economic cost sitting underneath all of this policy language, because trade disputes at this scale eventually show up in employment data. The Labor Department's job growth figures from July 2025, reported at the time by Deadline, showed the American economy adding just 73,000 jobs that month, with figures for May and June revised sharply downward. Economists interviewed at the time pointed to several contributing factors beyond tariffs alone, including cuts to federal government jobs and a more restrictive immigration policy, but they specifically flagged the uncertainty created by an unpredictable tariff regime as a reason employers were reluctant to expand their workforces while the rules kept changing underneath them. On the Canadian side, the layoffs at Algoma Steel late in 2025, affecting roughly 1,000 workers, offer a similarly concrete illustration of how abstract trade policy translates into real job losses for real families in specific communities. Ontario's premier, at the time, pledged publicly to keep fighting for those jobs, a comment that captured just how directly this dispute reached down into provincial politics far from the negotiating rooms in Washington and Ottawa. Provincial politics, in fact, have played a bigger role in this story than they might first appear to. Ontario Premier Doug Ford was among the provincial leaders who publicly backed Carney's approach to the negotiations, telling reporters at one point that he supported the Prime Minister's strategy completely. That kind of provincial buy-in matters in Canada's federal system, where premiers control significant levers, including provincial liquor authorities like Ontario's LCBO, which is precisely why Carney's request to restock American alcohol had to go through the premiers rather than simply being announced unilaterally from Ottawa. The retaliatory measures taken back in 2025, pulling American bourbon and wine off store shelves across multiple provinces, were themselves a coordinated multi-province action, not a single federal decision, and unwinding them required that same coordinated province-by-province cooperation once the framework deal began to take shape in August 2026. There is one more piece of this story worth flagging honestly, because it goes to the credibility of the reporting itself rather than to any particular fact. Coverage of trade negotiations like this one often relies heavily on sources described only as officials familiar with the talks, or industry executives following the discussions, phrasing that appears repeatedly across the Washington Post, CNBC, and CBC's reporting on this deal. That kind of sourcing is standard practice in trade journalism, since the actual negotiating rooms are closed and the participants are often not authorized to speak on the record before a deal is finalized. But it also means that some of the specific details floated in this script, particularly around Keystone XL and the exact scope of steel and aluminum tariff reductions, carry a level of uncertainty that a fully signed and published agreement would eliminate. Treating those details as confirmed fact before that publication happens would be getting ahead of what the record actually supports, which is exactly the kind of overreach this script has tried to avoid throughout. Taken together, all of this paints a picture of a relationship that is simultaneously deeply cooperative and persistently strained, sometimes within the same news cycle. Ottawa and Washington remain, by almost every measure, among the closest trading partners on the planet, bound together by supply chains that cross the border multiple times before a single finished product ever reaches a store shelf in either country. And yet, that same closeness has, over the past 18 months, been treated by one side as leverage to be squeezed again and again, and by the other as a relationship worth quietly, repeatedly absorbing pressure to preserve. Whether the framework deal announced this week in Washington finally breaks that cycle, or simply becomes the latest pause before the next deadline, is something only the coming weeks will actually settle. Let us know where you land, and we will see you in the next one once the actual text of this deal, and not just the framework, finally makes it into the open.